Hey, old-timer, you missed a spot back there by the briefing room.
A SEAL instructor stood in the middle of a polished hallway at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, watching an old man push a mop bucket across the floor. The instructor, a broad-shouldered lieutenant in his mid-30s, had just finished running 26 candidates through surf torture at 5 in the morning. He was exhausted, irritated, and looking for someone to talk down to. The old janitor, a man who looked to be in his mid-70s, with deep lines carved into his sun-beaten face and hands that trembled slightly around the mop handle, fit the bill perfectly. "Hey, old-timer," the instructor called out, loud enough for 3 other SEALs walking past to hear. "You missed a spot back there by the briefing room. You want me to show you how a mop works?" The old man didn't look up. He just kept mopping, slow and steady, the way a man mops when he's done it 10,000 times and doesn't need anyone's opinion about it. The instructor laughed. The SEALs behind him chuckled, and nobody in that hallway had any idea that within the next 45 minutes, every single one of them would be standing at attention, barely able to breathe because of what that old janitor was about to say. If you believe that real heroes don't always wear uniforms, comment "Scorpion" right now. His name was Earl Raymond Haskell. He was 76 years old. He had been mopping floors at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado for the past 11 years, ever since his wife, Margaret, had passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2012. Before that, he'd spent 3 quiet years sitting in the same recliner in their small house in Imperial Beach, watching her fade and holding her hand through every round of chemotherapy that didn't work. And before that, before the quiet years and the grief and the slow collapse of the only life he'd ever wanted, Earl Haskell had been something else entirely. But nobody at the base knew that. Nobody asked. He was just the janitor. The old guy who showed up at 4 in the morning before the candidates arrived for basic underwater demolition/SEAL training and made sure the floors were clean, the heads were stocked, and the trash cans were empty. He wore the same faded blue coveralls every day, the same scuffed work boots, the same plain white t-shirt underneath. He kept his grey hair cropped short in a style that could have been military, but could just as easily have been a man who didn't care about fashion. He moved slowly, not because he was lazy, but because his left knee had been rebuilt twice, and his lower back carried 3 compressed discs from things that happened in places he never talked about. The younger staff on base barely noticed him. The SEAL candidates, the ones going through the most brutal military selection process on Earth, didn't notice him at all. They were too busy trying not to drown, not to quit, not to ring that brass bell that meant their dream was over. Earl understood that. He understood it better than any of them could have possibly imagined. The instructor who had called him out that morning was Lieutenant Kyle Decker. Decker was a good SEAL. He'd completed 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to an undisclosed location in East Africa. He had a silver star and a reputation for being hard but fair with the candidates. But Decker also had a blind spot that a lot of younger operators had. He assumed that the world was divided into 2 categories: people who had earned the trident and people who hadn't. And if you hadn't earned it, you were furniture. Useful, maybe, but not worth real conversation. Earl had seen that attitude before. He'd seen it in 1971, in 1983, in 1990, and in 2003. He'd seen it in young men who thought that their war was the only war that ever mattered, that their suffering was the first suffering anyone had ever endured, that the mud on their boots was somehow different from the mud on every boot that came before. He didn't blame them for it. It was part of being young, part of being trained to believe you were invincible. But it still stung sometimes, when they looked right through him like he was a piece of the wall. That particular morning, the incident in the hallway might have ended there. Decker's comment, the chuckle from the passing SEALs, Earl's silence. It had happened before, it would happen again. But fate, or whatever you want to call it, had other plans. Because 10 minutes after that hallway exchange, something happened that changed the trajectory of the entire day. The base was preparing for a visit. Not just any visit. Rear Admiral James Constantine Whitfield, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, was arriving for a quarterly inspection and a series of meetings with the training cadre. Whitfield was a legend. He'd risen through the ranks from a young SEAL officer in the late 1980s to become one of the most respected flag officers in the entire Special Operations community. He had commanded SEAL Team 3, then SEAL Team 6's training detachment, then DevGru operations, and now he oversaw the entire pipeline that produced every Navy SEAL in the United States military. When Whitfield visited a base, people noticed. Uniforms got pressed, floors got mopped twice, attitudes adjusted, and that's exactly why Lieutenant Decker found himself walking back down the same hallway 30 minutes later, this time with a different energy. The Admiral was arriving in less than an hour, and Decker needed that hallway spotless. He found Earl in the same place, still mopping, still slow, still methodical. "Hey," Decker said, his voice carrying the clipped urgency of a man who suddenly cared very much about clean floors. "Admiral Whitfield is coming in at 0800. I need this whole corridor looking like glass. Can you handle that, or do I need to get someone else?" Earl looked up for the first time that morning. His eyes were pale blue, almost grey, the colour of old denim that's been washed 1,000 times. There was no anger in them, no resentment, just a kind of tired patience, the way a mountain looks at a cloud that thinks it's important. "I'll have it done," Earl said. His voice was quiet, slightly hoarse, the voice of a man who didn't use it much anymore. Decker stared at him for a beat, then nodded and walked away. But one of the other SEALs, a younger petty officer named Rivera, lingered. Rivera was 28, a second-class petty officer fresh off his first deployment. He had the kind of confidence that comes from surviving BUD/S, and the kind of curiosity that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. He watched Earl wring out the mop with hands that, despite the trembling, moved with a practiced efficiency that suggested years of something more demanding than janitorial work. "You prior service?" Rivera asked. It was a casual question, the kind one military person asks another when they recognize something familiar in the way someone carries themselves. Earl paused. He looked at Rivera the way you look at a photograph you haven't seen in a long time. Then he just gave a small nod and went back to mopping. Rivera waited for more, but nothing came. He shrugged and headed toward the briefing room where the morning's training schedule was being posted. The briefing room was filling up. 12 SEAL instructors, 8 support staff, and the senior training officer, Commander Patrick Walsh, were assembling for the pre-inspection brief. Walsh was a meticulous officer, the kind of man who checked the alignment of chairs before a meeting and counted ceiling tiles when he was bored. He ran through the inspection checklist with the efficiency of someone who had done it 50 times. Everything was in order. The training metrics were solid. BUD/S Class 347 was in its 3rd week of first phase, and the attrition rate was right on the historical average of 73%. The facilities were clean. The equipment was maintained. The only variable Walsh couldn't control was the human element, and that's the one that always caused problems. At 0745, a black Suburban with government plates pulled up to the main entrance. 2 armed security personnel stepped out first, followed by a staff officer carrying a leather portfolio, and then Admiral Whitfield himself. He was 61 years old, tall, lean, with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone they used to build the base. His uniform was immaculate. His chest carried 4 rows of ribbons that told a story spanning 4 decades. He moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent his entire adult life in the most physically demanding community in the United States military, and had come out the other side not just intact, but in command of all of it. Walsh met the Admiral at the door with a sharp salute and a rehearsed greeting. Whitfield returned the salute, shook Walsh's hand, and immediately began walking the corridors. He didn't need a tour. He knew this facility the way a priest knows his church. He'd trained here. He'd bled here. He'd watched men quit here, and watched other men become something extraordinary here. Every tile, every doorframe, every scratch on the walls told a story he could read fluently. The tour was proceeding exactly as planned. Walsh narrated the improvements they'd made to the pool facility. Decker briefed the Admiral on the current class's progress. The support staff stayed out of the way and looked professional. Everything was textbook. And then the Admiral turned a corner and stopped. He stopped the way a hunting dog stops when it catches a scent. Dead still, eyes locked, every muscle frozen in place. The staff officer behind him nearly collided with his back. Walsh, mid-sentence about pool renovation budgets, trailed off into silence. Everyone looked at the Admiral. The Admiral was looking at the end of the hallway, at the old janitor, at Earl. Earl was on his hands and knees now, using a rag to clean a scuff mark off the baseboard near the floor. He hadn't noticed the entourage. He was focused on the scuff mark the way a surgeon focuses on a suture, completely absorbed in the small task in front of him. His coveralls were damp at the knees. His grey hair was slightly mussed. He looked like exactly what everyone on that base thought he was. An old man cleaning a floor. "Who is that?" Admiral Whitfield asked. His voice had changed. It was no longer the measured, authoritative tone of a flag officer conducting an inspection. It was something else. Something lower, more personal, almost reverent. Walsh looked down the hallway, saw the janitor, and immediately felt a flash of irritation. The janitor was supposed to be finished and out of the corridors before the Admiral arrived. That had been explicitly stated in the pre-inspection brief. "That's, one of our facilities maintenance staff, sir," Walsh said quickly. "I apologise, he should have cleared the area by now. I'll have him—" "What's his name?" Whitfield interrupted. Walsh blinked. In 17 years of service, he had never heard an Admiral ask for the name of a janitor. I'm not sure, sir. Decker, do you know the janitor's name?" Decker, standing 3 paces behind, shook his head. "No, sir. He's been here a while, though. Quiet guy." The Admiral didn't respond to either of them. He started walking down the hallway, not inspecting, not touring, walking, with purpose, with something that the men behind him couldn't identify but could feel. It was the kind of walk that makes other people stop breathing. Walsh and Decker exchanged a glance. Rivera, standing at the back of the group, felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was happening. Something none of them understood yet. Earl heard the footsteps approaching. Multiple sets, heavy, deliberate. He figured it was the inspection party and cursed himself silently for not finishing faster. He started to push himself up off his knees, planning to grab his bucket and mop and disappear into the nearest supply closet until they passed. But when he looked up, he didn't see a group of officers walking past. He saw one man standing directly in front of him, 3 feet away, looking down at him with an expression that didn't match anything Earl had expected. The man was an Admiral. 2 stars. Earl's eyes, still sharp despite the years, read the ribbons automatically. The same way a musician reads sheet music. Trident. Bronze star with Valor. Purple heart. 2 of them. Combat action ribbon. And there, near the top, the ribbon that made Earl's breath catch in his chest. The Presidential Unit Citation with the specific campaign star that Earl recognised because he had been there when it was earned. The Admiral was staring at Earl's hands, specifically at Earl's left hand, where a faded tattoo was visible on the webbing between his thumb and index finger. It was a small tattoo, barely an inch across, so old and sun-faded that most people would dismiss it as a smudge or a scar. But it wasn't a smudge. It was a scorpion. A very specific scorpion, rendered in a very specific style, with its tail curved in a very specific way that meant something to a very specific group of people in the United States Navy. The hallway went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens in a church or at a graveside or in the moment before a breach charge detonates. Admiral Whitfield lowered himself. Not a casual crouch. He went down on one knee, right there in that polished hallway, in his dress uniform, in front of his staff and the training cadre and Lieutenant Decker and everyone else. He went down on one knee in front of the janitor. "Earl?" the Admiral said. His voice cracked on the word. Just barely. Just enough for the men behind him to hear it and feel their stomachs drop. Earl looked at the Admiral's face, really looked. Past the stars, past the shaved head, past the decades. And then Earl's pale blue eyes widened, just slightly, and something shifted behind them. Something that had been locked away in a vault for a very long time. "Jimmy," Earl said softly, "you got tall." For 3 full seconds nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Admiral James Constantine Whitfield, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, the man who oversaw the creation of every Navy SEAL in the United States, was kneeling in front of an elderly janitor, and the janitor had just called him by his childhood nickname. Walsh's mouth was open. Decker's face had gone completely white. Rivera at the back of the group felt tears building behind his eyes and had no idea why. The Admiral stood up slowly. He turned to face the group of men behind him. His face had changed. The professional mask was gone. What was underneath was something raw, something emotional, something that none of them had ever seen from a flag officer. "Do any of you know who this man is?" Whitfield asked. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. "Does anyone in this building know who this man is?" Whitfield asked again, louder this time, and there was an edge to his voice that made every SEAL in that hallway instinctively straighten their spines. Walsh cleared his throat. "No, sir." The Admiral looked at Decker. "You, a lieutenant. You were in this hallway this morning, weren't you? Decker swallowed. Yes, sir. And what did you say to this man? Decker's jaw worked. His eyes flicked to Earl, then back to the Admiral. I asked him to make sure the floor was clean for your arrival, sir. Is that all you said? The question hung in the air like a blade. Decker could feel Rivera's eyes on the back of his head. He could feel the truth pressing against his teeth like something that wanted to come out whether he allowed it or not. I may have been disrespectful in my tone, sir. The Admiral nodded slowly, not in agreement, in confirmation, like a doctor confirming a diagnosis he already knew was terminal. This man, Admiral Whitfield said, turning back to gesture at Earl, who was standing now, mop in one hand, rag in the other, looking profoundly uncomfortable with the attention, is Master Chief Earl Raymond Haskell, United States Navy, retired. Call sign, Scorpion. The words hit the hallway like a concussion grenade. Decker physically took a step back. Walsh grabbed the wall. Rivera's hand went to his mouth. Scorpion, Walsh whispered. He said it the way a Catholic whispers the name of a saint. Because in the SEAL community, Scorpion wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. It was the kind of name that got passed down in whispers during Hell Week, in stories told over beers at Danny's in Coronado, in the classified after-action reports that only people with the highest clearances ever got to read. Scorpion was the call sign of the man who had built the modern SEAL close-quarters combat program, the man who had designed the shooting packages that every SEAL team in the world still used as their foundation, the man who had personally trained more operators than any single individual in the history of naval special warfare, the man who had been the lead instructor at the most classified training facility the Navy had ever operated, a facility so secret that its existence wasn't acknowledged until 15 years after it was closed. The man who had gone into Grenada, Panama, the Gulf, Somalia, and a half-dozen other places that still didn't have names in any official record. Scorpion. And he was standing in a hallway in Coronado, California, holding a mop. Between 1972 and 2004, the Admiral continued, his voice carrying the weight of a eulogy delivered for someone who was still breathing. Master Chief Haskell served 32 consecutive years in naval special warfare. He completed 9 combat deployments. He earned the Navy Cross, the Silver Star with 2 clusters, the Bronze Star with Valor, 3 Purple Hearts, and more commendations than I have time to list. He was the senior enlisted advisor at SEAL Team 2, the lead CQB instructor at what was then called the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, and for 11 years the chief instructor at a training program so classified that the men who went through it were told they'd go to Leavenworth if they ever spoke about it publicly. The Admiral paused. He looked at each man in the hallway individually, one by one, making sure they understood, making sure this was sinking in. Every shooting drill you ran this morning, Lieutenant Decker, was designed by this man. Every room-clearing technique you teach those BUD/S candidates was refined by this man. The hand-to-hand combat program, the demolition sequencing, the maritime interdiction protocols, all of it traces back to work that Master Chief Haskell did when most of you were still in elementary school. Decker looked like he'd been shot, not with a bullet, with understanding. The kind of understanding that rearranges everything you thought you knew about the world and leaves you standing in the wreckage of your own assumptions. He stared at Earl, at the faded coveralls, at the scuffed boots, at the trembling hands that had, according to the Admiral, designed the fighting doctrine of the most elite special operations force on the planet. "Sir," Decker started, but his voice broke and he had to start again. "Sir, I didn't know. I had no idea." "That's the point, Lieutenant," the Admiral said quietly. "You didn't know, and you didn't ask. You saw a man with a mop, and you decided you knew everything you needed to know about him." The rebuke was surgical, clean, no raised voice, no theatrics, just a truth delivered with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years learning how to put things exactly where they needed to go. Earl stood through all of this with the same quiet stillness he brought to everything. He didn't puff up, he didn't smile with satisfaction, he didn't seem to enjoy Decker's discomfort. If anything, he looked slightly pained, the way a man looks when a wound he thought had healed gets touched unexpectedly. "Jim," Earl said to the Admiral, using the familiar name again, "you don't need to do all this. I'm just here to clean the floors." The Admiral turned back to him, and now, for the first time, the men in that hallway saw Admiral Whitfield's eyes glistening, not crying, not yet, but close. "You trained me, Earl," the Admiral said. "Summer of '88. I was 22 years old, and I thought I was the toughest man alive. You broke me down in 3 days and rebuilt me in 6 months. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished in this uniform started with you standing over me in a shoot house in Virginia Beach telling me that my trigger discipline was going to get my teammates killed. Earl's expression shifted then, just slightly, a softening around the eyes that might have been a smile on a different kind of man. Your trigger discipline was terrible, Jimmy. Just awful. A sound escaped from Rivera's throat that was half laugh and half sob. Even Walsh, the perpetually rigid commander, felt his composure crack. The Admiral laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from a place so deep it surprises even the person it comes from. It was, the Admiral admitted. It really was. The Admiral straightened. The warmth in his face cooled into something more official, though the emotion behind it remained visible. Commander Walsh, I want Master Chief Haskell's full service record pulled and reviewed by end of day. I want to know why a man with a Navy Cross is mopping floors at a facility that wouldn't exist without him. I want to know who processed his retirement, what benefits he's receiving, and whether this command has failed in its obligations to one of its own. Walsh nodded rapidly. Yes, sir, immediately. And Lieutenant Decker? Decker stiffened. Sir, after this inspection, you and I are going to have a conversation about leadership. Real leadership. Not the kind where you run men through surf torture and think that makes you hard. The kind where you recognize the men around you. All of them. Regardless of what they're wearing. Yes, sir. The words came out barely above a whisper. What happened over the next several hours at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado would become one of the most talked about events in the SEAL community for years afterward. Not because of a battle, not because of an operation, but because of a janitor. Admiral Whitfield cancelled the rest of the formal inspection. He spent the morning sitting with Earl in the base commander's office, Walsh's own office, which Walsh vacated without being asked, drinking coffee from the same battered mugs the training cadre used. The door was closed for almost 2 hours. Nobody knows everything that was said in that room. But the staff officer who brought in a second pot of coffee reported that when he opened the door, both men were sitting in silence, looking at an old photograph that Earl had pulled from his wallet. The photograph, the staff officer later described, showed a group of young men in unmarked fatigues, standing in front of a building that had no identifying features. Some of the men in the photograph were smiling, some were not. All of them had the look of people who had seen things that would never fit into words. Earl was pointing at one of the faces in the photograph, and the Admiral was nodding. When the office door finally opened, the Admiral's first order was unexpected. He asked Walsh to assemble every SEAL instructor on the base in the main briefing room. Not for the inspection brief, for something else. Walsh complied within 20 minutes. 14 instructors, including Decker, gathered in the briefing room. They sat in the same chairs where they normally reviewed training schedules and candidate evaluations. But the energy in the room was different. Electric. Nervous. Word had spread. The hallway story had moved through the base the way fire moves through dry grass. By the time the instructors were seated, every one of them knew that the old janitor was Scorpion. They just didn't fully understand what that meant yet. The Admiral entered the briefing room with Earl walking beside him. Earl had not changed out of his coveralls. He had not cleaned up or put on anything different. He walked into that room of elite warriors looking exactly like what they had always assumed he was. A janitor, and that was the point. The Admiral stood at the front of the room. Earl stood slightly behind him to his left, as if he were trying to disappear into the corner. Old habits. Enlisted men stood behind officers, even retired enlisted men, even legends. Gentlemen, the Admiral began, I'm going to tell you a story, and when I'm done, I think you'll understand why I cancelled the inspection. He paused, looked at Earl, and then looked back at the room. In January of 1991, 48 hours before the air campaign began in Operation Desert Storm, a 6-man SEAL element was inserted into southern Iraq to conduct a reconnaissance mission on a series of coastal defense positions that were threatening the amphibious deception operation. The insertion went wrong almost immediately. Their boat was detected by Iraqi radar. They came under fire from shore batteries before they even reached the beach. 2 men were wounded in the first 60 seconds. The team leader was hit in the leg and the shoulder and couldn't walk. The room was completely still. Every man in it had heard some version of Desert Storm stories before, but not this one, not from an admiral, not like this. The senior enlisted man on that team was a chief petty officer named Earl Haskell, call sign Scorpion. With 2 wounded teammates and the mission compromised, standard doctrine called for an immediate extraction. Pull out, call for pickup, get the wounded home, that's what the book says. The Admiral's voice dropped. Scorpion didn't read the book. Chief Haskell assessed the situation and made a decision that would have ended his career if it had gone wrong. He left 2 men with the wounded to provide security and establish a comlink, took 1 swimmer, and went into the water. They swam 1,100 meters through enemy-controlled waters in complete darkness, navigated past 2 patrol boats using nothing but dead reckoning and sheer audacity, reached the coastal defense positions, and spent 4 hours conducting the reconnaissance that the entire team had been sent to do. 4 hours! In enemy territory, with no backup, with the knowledge that if they were captured, no one was coming for them. The intelligence they gathered was transmitted via burst communication to the fleet, and it directly informed the targeting packages that neutralized those coastal positions 48 hours later. Military analysts estimated that the information provided by that 2-man recon saved between 200 and 400 coalition lives during the subsequent amphibious feint. The Admiral let those numbers sit in the air, 200 to 400 lives, numbers that were abstract in a briefing room but that represented real people, fathers, brothers, sons, friends, people who went home because an enlisted man decided that the mission mattered more than the book. Chief Haskell received the Navy Cross for that operation, the Admiral continued. It was presented in a classified ceremony that none of you would have read about because the details weren't declassified until 2009. By that time, Earl had already retired and disappeared from the community. He didn't do interviews, he didn't write a book, he didn't go on podcasts, he just stopped. The Admiral looked at Earl. Earl was looking at the floor, not in shame, in memory. The floor of that briefing room was very far from the water off the coast of Kuwait, but Earl's eyes said he was back there. He was always back there, in some part of himself that never fully came home. After Desert Storm, Scorpion was recruited into the training cadre, and for the next 13 years, he became the most important instructor in the history of this command. He didn't just teach shooting and tactics, he taught philosophy. He taught what it meant to be a SEAL at the level that goes beyond physical capability and into something that I can only describe as moral architecture. He built the ethical framework that we still use to train our operators. The idea that the hardest thing about being a SEAL isn't the cold water or the long runs or the sleep deprivation. The hardest thing is making the right decision when every part of your body is screaming at you to make the wrong one. The Admiral paused and looked directly at Decker. He taught me that, in a shoot house in Virginia Beach, in 1988, when I was younger than most of you and twice as stupid. Several of the instructors shifted in their seats, not from discomfort, from recognition, from the slow, dawning, humbling realization that the man standing in the corner in faded blue coveralls had been the architect of their professional identity, that the doctrine they quoted, the techniques they demonstrated, the standards they enforced had all been created or refined by a man they had walked past 1,000 times without a word. Decker, who had been sitting in the front row, stood up. He didn't ask permission. He didn't raise his hand. He just stood. And then he walked to the front of the room, stopped in front of Earl, and executed a salute so precise, so sharp, so loaded with meaning that it could have cut glass. "Master Chief," Decker said, "I apologize. Not just for this morning, for every morning." Earl looked at Decker. For a long moment he studied the younger man's face the way an instructor studies a candidate, looking for something. Sincerity maybe, or understanding, or just the willingness to be better. Whatever he was looking for, he found it. Earl returned the salute, slowly, precisely, with the muscle memory of a man who had saluted 10,000 times and meant it every single time. "You run a good program here, Lieutenant," Earl said quietly. "Your candidates are solid. I watch them from the window sometimes. Class 347 has some good ones. Candidate Morrison and Candidate Tran. Keep your eye on those two. They've got something." Decker's composure finally broke. His jaw trembled. His eyes went red. He nodded, unable to speak, and returned to his seat. One by one, every instructor in that room stood up and saluted. It wasn't ordered, it wasn't coordinated. It was spontaneous, organic, the kind of thing that happens when a group of warriors recognizes one of their own who has been invisible for too long. Rivera was the last to salute, and when he did, his hand was shaking so hard he could barely hold it steady. Earl stood there and received each salute with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. He didn't cry. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there, in his coveralls, with his mop probably still sitting in the hallway where he'd left it, and he accepted the respect that had been owed to him for over a decade. After the salutes, the Admiral made several immediate decisions. First, he directed that Earl's name be added to the Wall of Honor at the Naval Special Warfare Center, where the names of distinguished operators and instructors are permanently displayed. Earl had never been nominated because he had retired during a period of administrative transition, and the paperwork had simply fallen through the cracks. Bureaucracy, the Admiral noted with unconcealed disgust, is the only enemy that never runs out of ammunition. Second, the Admiral directed a full review of Earl's retirement benefits. It was discovered within days that Earl had been receiving a reduced pension due to an administrative error in the processing of his retirement paperwork in 2004. He had been underpaid for almost 20 years. The correction, when it was finally made, included back pay that amounted to nearly $200,000. Earl hadn't known, or if he had known, he hadn't complained. He was a man who had been trained to endure, and endurance for Earl meant not asking for things he felt he hadn't earned, even when he had earned them 10 times over. Third, the Admiral established what he called the Haskell Protocol, a new standard requiring that every SEAL training facility maintain awareness of retired special warfare personnel in their area of operations. No more invisible veterans, no more Master Chiefs mopping floors while the men they trained walked past them like strangers. Earl Haskell didn't stop working at the base. He chose not to. The Admiral offered him an honorary position, a desk, a title. Earl declined all of it. He said he liked mopping floors. He said it gave him something to do in the mornings, something to keep his hands busy, something to keep him close to the sound of young men becoming what he had once been. But things changed after that day. They changed in ways that were small but significant, the kind of changes that ripple outward like a stone dropped in still water. Decker started arriving at the base 30 minutes early, not for paperwork. He came early to have coffee with Earl. They sat in the break room near the equipment cage, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups, and Earl would talk about the old days. Not the classified stuff, the human stuff, the fear he'd felt on his first deployment, the letter he'd written to Margaret before every operation, the way the ocean looked at night off the coast of a country he wasn't supposed to be near, the sound a man makes when he decides he's not going to quit. Decker listened. He listened the way a student listens to a teacher who's been waiting years for someone to ask the right questions. Rivera started a quiet tradition. Every Friday morning before the candidates arrived, he placed a fresh cup of coffee on the ledge outside Earl's supply closet. He never said anything about it. Earl never mentioned it. But the cup was always empty when Rivera walked by later. Walsh, the base commander, had Earl's Navy Cross citation framed and mounted in the main corridor. The same corridor where Earl mopped. Earl had objected initially, said it was unnecessary, said the citation didn't belong on a wall where people walked with dirty boots. Walsh had simply said, "It belongs exactly where people walk, Master Chief, so they never forget who walked here before them." The citation hung there, modest and unadorned, a small brass plaque with words that described an act of courage that most people would never fully comprehend. And every morning, when Earl mopped that stretch of corridor, he mopped around the frame carefully, the way a groundskeeper tends a grave. The story spread. It spread the way stories do in the military, through informal channels, late-night conversations in team rooms, passing mentions and training briefs. Within months, Earl's story had reached SEAL teams around the world. Operators who had never met him but who used his techniques every day now knew his name. An informal tradition started among some of the teams. Whenever they completed a training evolution that was based on one of Earl's original protocols, someone would say "Scorpion" under their breath. Not as a cheer or a slogan, as an acknowledgement. A quiet recognition that the things they did and the way they did them had been born in the mind of a man who was, at that very moment, probably mopping a floor somewhere in Coronado. Candidates in BUD/S Class 348 and beyond started hearing the name during Hell Week. Instructors would lean down to a candidate lying face first in the surf zone, shivering, exhausted, ready to quit, and say, "Scorpion didn't quit. Scorpion swam 1,100 meters into enemy territory with no backup. You can make it to breakfast." It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't authorized by any training directive. It was just something that happened, organically, because the story was true, and truth has a way of finding the places where it's needed most. 2 years later, Earl Raymond Haskell was invited to be the keynote speaker at the Naval Special Warfare Foundation's annual dinner in Virginia Beach. He almost didn't go. He said he didn't have anything to say that anyone would want to hear. Decker, who had by then become one of Earl's closest friends, convinced him by pointing out that if Earl could swim into enemy-controlled waters with no backup, he could probably handle a room full of people eating chicken. Earl wore his dress blues for the first time in 20 years. They still fit, barely. He stood at the podium in front of 600 people, active duty SEALs, retired operators, families, politicians, defense officials, and he spoke for 11 minutes. He didn't talk about himself, he didn't talk about Desert Storm or the Navy Cross or the training programs he'd built. He talked about Margaret. He talked about how she had waited for him through 9 deployments and never once asked him to choose between her and the teams. He talked about how she'd held the family together while he was teaching other men's husbands how to come home alive. He talked about how the hardest thing he'd ever done wasn't swimming into enemy waters or building a combat training program from scratch. The hardest thing he'd ever done was watching the strongest person he'd ever known lose a fight with her own body and not being able to do a single thing about it. He said that the real heroes weren't the ones who earned medals. The real heroes were the ones who stayed, who waited, who loved without condition and without complaint. The ones whose names never ended up on any wall but whose sacrifice made every name on every wall possible. 600 people stood, 600 people applauded, and Earl Raymond Haskell, Master Chief United States Navy, retired, callsign Scorpion, the man who had mopped floors for 11 years in a building full of warriors who didn't know his name, stood at that podium and cried for the first time since Margaret died. The next morning he was back at work at 0400, same faded blue coveralls, same scuffed boots, same mop. But now, when he walked those corridors, people saw him. Not the coveralls, not the mop, not the trembling hands or the slow gait or the grey hair. They saw him. Decker was already in the break room with 2 cups of coffee. Rivera had left a note on the supply closet door that simply read, Scorpion. A BUD/S candidate, soaking wet and shivering from a pre-dawn ocean swim, passed Earl in the hallway and snapped to attention. He was 22 years old, terrified, exhausted, and running on nothing but stubbornness and the desperate hope that he might someday be worthy of the trident. He looked at the old janitor and saw something that nobody had seen for a very long time. He saw the man. "Good morning, Master Chief," the candidate said. Earl looked at the young man, soaking wet, sand in his hair, eyes burning with the kind of fire that Earl recognized because he'd seen it in his own reflection 54 years ago. "Good morning, candidate," Earl said. "Keep going, it gets better." The candidate nodded and continued down the hallway toward whatever misery was waiting for him next. And Earl Haskell dipped his mop back into the bucket, wrung it out with hands that had once held the future of the most elite fighting force on Earth, and continued cleaning the floor. Because that was the job, and Earl Haskell, whatever the job was, did it right. If you believe that every veteran deserves to be seen, not for what they wear but for what they've done, then subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you pass someone you think you know everything about, remember Scorpion. Remember that the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous, the most decorated, and the most worthy of your respect. Comment Scorpion if this story moved you, and never ever judge a man by his mop.